Let's now cross to British activist and journalist Vanessa Beeley. Many thanks for joining us on the programme, Vanessa. It's nice to see you. So what do you think is the motive of the US by expressing support for the Iranian protests like this?
Oh, God. I mean, the United States is so profoundly hypocritical whenever it takes up a human rights issue, a women's rights issue. I mean, in Iran, for example, where were the rights of the women and of the civilians of Iran when the US was supplying chemical weapons to Iraq to be used against Iranian civilians? Where are the rights of the women in Iran when the US is imposing savage economic sanctions on the people of Iran? Where are the rights of women in Syria when the West, the US, the UK cabal is funding terrorist groups that would take women's rights back to the Dark Ages, to the medieval era in Syria? And this weaponization of human rights is absolutely criminal, because what it effectively is a dismissal of any kind of human rights, because they are weaponized invariably to go to war or to destabilize a target country. This means that the West and the US have absolutely no concern for human rights or women's rights at all.
And do you think the people, or the women in Iran, of course, want the US to help, or do you think they would prefer to solve their own matters without outside intervention?
I think any country should be allowed to solve its own issues without foreign intervention. The fact is that the US has a history of almost 200 years of interfering in the political and economic and humanitarian affairs of sovereign nations, which has invariably led to the devastation of those countries. They went into Afghanistan on the basis of women's rights. That was one of the canards that was used to sell the military presence in Afghanistan. Look at women's rights now in Afghanistan, 22 years on since the US got involved there. Women's rights in Afghanistan are probably at their lowest level in history, right? The US is a power to stunt the development of any country, and it's done deliberately.
So the Biden administration is saying now that it's going to take aggressive steps towards Iran because of the protests. Now, previously, this has been in the form of sanctions. Have such actions proven to be effective? And what could Biden mean by that?
Well, I mean, you have to also put it in the context of the wavering nuclear deal, the fact that in Western media, certainly, there is a lot of emphasis on the fact that Iran is potentially supplying drones to Russia in the conflict in Ukraine. So, of course, if that is the case, then Iran must be punished. And the way the US punishes any nation that steps out of line or ceases to comply with US supremacy or hegemony is to create destabilization and disruption in the country, which effectively, in many cases, enables the US to intervene either politically, economically, or militarily. Of course, in Iran, I think it's very unlikely that the US is ever going to intervene militarily. But I think economically they will increase the sanctions, because Iran is already under sanctions. We shouldn't forget that, as are the majority of the US enemies, in inverted commas. While, of course, if we're talking human rights, where are the US sanctions against Israel, against Saudi Arabia, against the Ukrainian ultranationalists and fascists that have been committing atrocities against the people of Donbass for 8 years since the US imposed the Nazi sympathetic regime in 2014. So, I think we can expect the US now to be revealing a degree of desperation. It is effectively losing the battle for hearts and minds. It's losing the military battle in Ukraine. It's lost the military battle in Syria. It can only continue to try to occupy Syrian resources, but even that is very probably coming to an end thanks to Syrian and Russian military operations against the US occupation and against the northwestern US-backed terrorist occupation. So, you know, the US has very little recourse. It only has its default position, which is sanctions or destabilization, and it's trying both in Iran, but Iran is ready for it, I believe.
Are there any signs of any foreign meddling on the ground in Tehran right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I haven't gone into it in huge detail, but I know that Mint Press News, for example, has just published a lot of information on some of the most prominent members of the so-called movement against the government in Iran. Showing their ties, of course, to US agencies, to intelligence agencies in the US. I mean, you know, what we're seeing is textbook US interference in the sovereign affairs of, the state affairs of a sovereign nation. It's no different to what they did in Syria, what they did in Ukraine, what they've done in Libya and in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And, you know, I think we also have to see this as part of the greater war against Russia.
Many thanks for your time today. Really appreciate your insight. We've been speaking to British activist and journalist Vanessa Beeley. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki.